This is the departure from your subject, but I really want to ask you, because you had research on this, on the Air Force problem and matters in the Soviet Union. We had B-17s operate out of a Russian base. And did you ever come across information on that? Mm-hmm. How long did they stay there? How many aircraft and so forth?
Gosh, I don't have a lot of that information off the top of my head. I actually knew an American that was involved in that. He's gone now. He met his wife there, but she was an American nurse that was at that base. But the Russian women pilots weren't involved there. Some of the French pilots in the Normandy-Niemann squadron did know and fly with the women at the same base, not in the same regiment, but from the same base. But most Americans never had any contact with the women pilots.
No, they operated out of the base.
Mm-hmm.
On a base, I don't know what base.
Yeah. Mark? Oh, I guess, do we need a microphone?
There's a question right here first.
Okay, sorry. Yes?
In our Lend-Lease program, we sent a lot of Bel Air Cobra P-39s over there. Did they ever fly those aircraft?
No.
I was wondering if you could describe in some kind of detail the various hoops you had to go through in order to get access to the pertinent archives, as well as how you tracked down some of these pilots and what you had to go through in order to interview them.
Okay. Well, as you both know, Soviet archives are tricky, and when I went there in '93, right after the coup, there were still many problems, mostly to do with people's salaries not being paid, and so people not showing up for work, with sometimes they're not having electricity, just budgetary issues. Very tricky about access. I worked through the Center of Military History in Moscow, but they wanted to kind of sequester me and just bring me documents and parcel things out to me, and I had to really battle with them to get out and get the documents. The interviews I did in a completely different way. I had a friend that was working in the archives, and I had put together a little questionnaire saying that I was interested in this particular subject, and if anyone knew people who had been involved in these units, I would like to get in contact with them. And one woman wrote back to me, Polina Gelman, and through her, I then got in touch with other people and set up a whole series of interviews. So all my interviews were done at people's homes, privately, independently of the Military History Institute, thank God, except for one or two things I did with some former generals through them. But that was so much better because I met people and their families, even though it was in terrible neighborhoods, and pensioners just lived in really bad circumstances. But that was where I was able to get letters, copies of letters, and people were very free in letting me copy, and often they had already made copies for me to give me letters and memoirs and photographs and things like that. So that's really where I got some of my best stuff. But then, of course, there were published unit histories. I got copies of unpublished unit histories for these particular regiments. They didn't have books about them, although the air armies they were in mentioned them. And then I got a number of archival documents that were daily logs, casualty lists, personnel lists, lists of awards, things like that. Yes? Oh, waiting for Mike. Do we have a mic here? Yes.
Was your research only with World War II, or what was the post-war involvement of women in the military?
Post-war, the women were almost all demobilized. I've got an article out about that in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies, which no one ever has heard of or read. One of these, David Glance's publication, very small thing, but yeah, I did a study of that actually. There were a few women that managed to stay in the Air Force for a few years, but you have to remember the Red Army had to go from 12 million down to 3 or 4 million. And it's kind of a last hired, first fired kind of thing. Plus, lots of people really were sick of the war. Some of these regiments, the Night Bomber Regiment never had a day off. I mean, it flew for the entire war, was never taken out of the front lines. And a lot of those people wanted to go home. The regiments were disbanded. So a few women managed to stay in for a few years at the end of the war. Most of them were immediately demobilized. Of course, that's not unusual. In the United States, the WASP were demobilized in December of 1944. In every country where women have ever fought, the Yugoslav partisans in Israel, they were all sent home right after the war. So again, that's something that's cross-cultural, and it's interesting to figure out why both democracies and communist states treated women the same way.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for sharing the story. It's a great story. Interesting enough, the transport during the United States at the same time, so I never knew about the attack size. That's pretty neat. What, did they get some, you said they were volunteers, but were they paid volunteers? How did they make a living during that time? And then also, follow-up to that is, you say right after the war they were all demoted, but further on, did they come up in the forces like we have in America?
Let's see. What was the first question again? Paid. They had full military rank and pay equal to men. Equal? Yes. So women in combat were volunteers. There were women that were mobilized for particular jobs in air defense and communications and a few other fields. But the women in combat roles in fighters and in tanks and the Army and some other things were all volunteers. But I mean, they were volunteers to join the service. Once in the service, they had full military rank. So they were not auxiliaries the way that they were in this country. So in that respect, they were treated completely equally to anyone else. They didn't attain the same rank as men because very few of them had been in service long enough to attain that experience or promotion. As far as, let's see, demobilization after the war, well, what's interesting is even during the war, they began to reinstitute segregated schools at the secondary level, and they began to institute policies in military schools for cadets that only men could be entered. So they had already set a platform. Stalin was no particular friend to women. He got stricter on abortion laws and divorce laws and everything else. So even before the war ended, those things were in place. So for a long time after the war, very, very few women could get into the service, primarily at the enlisted level. Very, very difficult for them to enter at the officer level until the 1990s when they went to an all-volunteer force and things became a little bit different. But I don't... There's a woman in England working on that question. Jenny Mathers writes about the Soviet Army today. Or I should say the Russian Army. Do you want to wait for the mic? 'Cause they're taping this session, so I think they want everyone on mic.
It's my understanding that during the Russian Civil War, and even during the revolution, during the Kerensky period, that there were all women infantry units or ground units. Was that the trigger in terms of introducing women units into the Soviet forces?
You know, I'm not sure if it's a trigger, but it's definitely a precedent. There's a good recent book called "They Fought for the Motherland." I'm trying to think. They Fought for the Motherland by Lori Stoff, about the units in the First World War. So there were women in the Russian forces on a scattered basis before the February Revolution. And then after the Kerensky government took over, they did create these units called battalions of death. Actually, there were men's battalions of death as well. These were supposed to be kind of suicide units, not exactly suicide units, but units that would take on the most dangerous tasks to try to inspire other people that were flagging at that point, because there was a lot of dissatisfaction in the Russian army by 1917. So there were a number of these women's battalions of death that were created, many volunteers, but the originator of that unit was such a harsh taskmaster that she whittled down 2,000 volunteers to 300. Only one unit went into combat, got one engagement, and then you had the October Revolution. Then during the Civil War, you had many women that did fight on the side of the Red Army in particular, not too many on the White Army. But in the Red Army, quite a few, and especially in the political commissar ranks, there were some famous women that were machine gunners, for example. So these things were in Russian history, and I'm not sure I would say common knowledge, but known to some people. You can go back to the Napoleonic Wars to find other examples as well. So there was a stronger history, or a better known history, of women in combat in Russia than many other countries.
Has there been an effort to translate your book into Russian and distribute it in Russia for their historical knowledge?
Is that me? No, not that I know of. Not unless they've done it without giving me copyright or royalties.
Is there any other question?
Dr. Pennington, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's become a bit of a tradition with Perspectives in Military History that we execute a poster for each of our
Execute?
speakers. Yeah, execute is a good way to put the.
This is my termination gift, is that it?
But this is a copy of the poster and now digital posters that we do, both through posts and around different facilities in town. Yours to take back with you, or we'll send back with you.
Thanks very much.
But thank you again very much for your presentation. Very interesting.